The Switch 2 is finally here, and it arrives with an interesting combination of limited new content, third-party ports, and upgraded Switch 1 games. As a massive GameCube fan though, I was especially excited to see the legendary Lunchbox finally make its way to Switch Online through Nintendo Classics, as they're now called. Only 3 GameCube titles are available at launch though: F-Zero GX, Wind Waker, and Soul Calibur 2. Strangely, after spending time with various Switch 2 content, I realized these 3 games actually correlate directly with other Switch 2 launch titles, whether intentionally or unintentionally. And that creates an interesting opportunity for comparison and analysis in terms of how well they hold up. F-Zero GX is a spiritual predecessor to Fast Fusion. Wind Waker is a mostly open-world, earlier entry in the Zelda series before Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. And Soul Calibur 2 obviously shares similarities with Street Fighter VI. Both are well-regarded entries in long-running fighting franchises. After revisiting each of these GameCube games, it's fascinating to discover how well they've held up to their modern alternatives after so many years. I do have some issues with the Switch 2 emulation itself and overall Nintendo Classics experience, but we'll come back to that. So let's analyze why each of these games is so impressive, especially relative to their unofficial counterparts, and even what that means for future GameCube titles on Switch 2. We'll start with F-Zero, which I think has aged the best out of the 3. F-Zero GX was one of, if not the best looking GameCube games, and it's my favorite arcade racer of all time. This game raced way ahead of the competition. I have a full retrospective on this topic on my channel. F-Zero delivered the Triforce of GameCube graphics back in 2003, 480p resolution, 60 frames per second, and anamorphic widescreen support. I've always said this game still looks and plays so good today that even a basic HD port would still feel like a modern game. And that's what we have here with the Switch 2 online upscaling. F-Zero GX looks impressive for a 22-year-old game. Environments are expansive and detailed all the way to distant horizons. The racetracks themselves are layered and well textured and rarely a simple flat surface. Instead, we're given interesting half-pipes, cylinders, and winding grid patterns that often use effects like transparency. Many levels even include cool environmental effects like rain and storms. For example, I think the lightning levels look fantastic as the storm flashes around you. And the forest tracks, my personal favorites, feature blowing leaves and beautiful waterfalls. Now, with the Switch 2 launch, we also received the wonderful new Fast Fusion. Check out the full review of this game on my channel. It's interesting to switch back and forth between these two titles. Obviously, Fast Fusion features much more detailed visuals with better lighting and textures. However, in terms of pure gameplay and performance, F-Zero GX holds its own surprisingly well since both are 60 FPS with great controls. What's really interesting though, Fast Fusion only runs at a native 540p or even lower in handheld mode and uses intense DLSS upscaling to reach higher resolutions. You can watch the excellent Digital Foundry deep dive on Fast Fusion for more info on that. This results in a slightly noisy image in motion, whereas F-Zero has very clear picture quality. F-Zero also has its own less aggressive upscaling in place, obviously, but that means both games are running at almost the same native resolution despite being 22 years apart. That's sort of crazy to think about when you consider the GameCube only had about 10 gigaflops of processing power compared to the Switch's supposed 3 teraflops, which is hundreds of times as much raw compute power. I understand that teraflops are not a great measure of final graphical output, but the diminishing returns of graphics relative to processing power are always interesting to analyze. Now, in terms of gameplay, I would argue the modern Switch 2 controllers are actually missing features required to play F-Zero properly. First, the Switch 2 doesn't have the right type of pressure-sensitive shoulder buttons like the GameCube had. F-Zero GX relied heavily on the ability to gradually press down and then click the tall, large GameCube shoulder buttons. The gradual pressure allowed you to drift softly side to side, whereas a full click would give you stronger drift and allow for advanced maneuvers. If you try playing F-Zero GX without the Switch Online GameCube controller, it actually feels a little bit overly sensitive and broken. This issue has impacted other ports or updates, such as Mario Sunshine on the 3D All-Stars port for Switch. Losing the finesse of the GameCube shoulder buttons makes it easy to slam into walls and miss sharp corners. F-Zero also has subtle input lag on Switch 2 that slightly hurts the experience. This might only be noticeable to those who have played the game on real GameCube hardware where the response time is perfect. F-Zero was also designed with the GameCube's button layout in mind, which I still think is the best button setup out there on any game controller to date. Essentially, you would use the large A button to accelerate, Y to boost, and X to bash enemies side to side. Due to the GameCube button layout, it was easily possible to sort of rest your thumb on 3 buttons at once, but this time it's much harder on the diamond layout of smaller Switch buttons. In fact, you basically have to use button remapping features of Switch to get this setup working acceptably. Now, the Wind Waker also holds up extremely well. Gamers have been clamoring for the Wind Waker HD port for ages, and I think this has caused many to forget how great the original still looks and feels. The HD remaster is beautiful, but also has various strange rendering quirks with the revamped lighting system. The original GameCube version had a flatter cell shading style that always looks perfect and smooth. Environments pack a good amount of detail and plenty of personality, such as Dragon Roost Cavern environments or the beautiful forest area. All kinds of subtle particle and lighting effects are at work here, and it all looks great, particularly some of the visually stunning boss fights. Link moves with super fluid animations, has nuanced facial animation, and can interact with the environment in a number of ways. The cel-shaded art style is timeless and helps prevent the game from feeling old. In fact, in terms of pure environment cleanliness and clarity, I think some parts of the Wind Waker actually look comparable or even cleaner than scenes from Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. Obviously, those later games feature vastly more complex worlds and layers of environmental details, but it's just interesting to compare similar environments back and forth. In many ways, Wind Waker doesn't look that old, it just looks different or simpler. For example, I think certain areas of Wind Waker hold up fairly well against similar environments from much later Zelda games. I really wish Wind Waker supported widescreen, but unfortunately it does not. For whatever reason, Wind Waker also has significantly more noticeable input lag than F-Zero or Soul Calibur 2. I really hope this gets patched and isn't an indicator of the performance of future GameCube game editions. For this game specifically, the input lag is very noticeable to the point that it can impact some of the timing-based parries and other elements. Wind Waker has also aged well due to its seamless pseudo-open world. Although the Great Sea remains controversial due to its vast size and slow traversal and parts of it being somewhat empty, it was still impressive for the time to seamlessly transition between so many different islands without load times or segmentation. There are load times when you enter specific locations like buildings, temples, or caves, but these are quick and fairly non-obtrusive. One of the ways older games often age poorly is overly segmented level designs split by tons of loading screens, but the world design of Wind Waker feels smooth and polished all the way through. Now, Soul Calibur 2 is an interesting one. This game was absolutely beautiful in 2002, and in my opinion it still is, due to rich environments with timeless designs that are still wonderful to battle across. These are 23-year-old environments on display, but they're still rich with color and detail and personality. Because it's a fighting game, all of the console's horsepower could be applied to these handcrafted environments designed for specific viewing angles. Soul Calibur 2 also really shines in the character roster. These are some of the most detailed character models of the generation, and their animations are just as high quality to match. Models are varied and even have limited cloth movements and other dynamic elements. For example, in terms of pure detail, I think Link's character model actually holds up fairly well against modern Zelda games. It's interesting to compare this game to Street Fighter VI right at launch here. For transparency, I have very little experience with the Street Fighter series. I've only played Street Fighter VI and IV and not to any meaningful depth. But I think it's interesting as we cut back and forth here how well Soul Calibur 2 holds up. This is certainly not a criticism of Street Fighter, but rather an appreciation for what the developers were able to accomplish on the original GameCube hardware, and yes, obviously Soul Calibur 2 was available on Xbox and PS2 as well. I'm curious to see what other third-party GameCube games make their way to Nintendo Classics. So although we only have 3 GameCube games so far, all of them look and feel great to play so many years later. I can't wait to see the library continue to expand and open up these games to new players. Obviously, you can play all of these games on emulators or the original hardware, but many newer or more casual players are probably not going to track these games down and set that up. It's great to see these buried titles start to be unearthed on official hardware. Yes, it's sad that we can't buy these individually and they're tied to a subscription, but I do think it's better than nothing. One area I wish Nintendo had put some effort into for these GameCube games is widescreen support. Although F-Zero and Soul Calibur do have 16:9 modes, 4:3 aspect ratio was very common for many 6th generation games, and it's one of the main factors that can cause them to feel dated. I imagine adding widescreen support probably isn't as simple as it might seem, since the original titles weren't always designed with that in mind. However, I wish there was some sort of forced widescreen resolution output where players could try it, and if there's issues or they don't like the experience, they can switch back to 4:3. Pre-rendered cinematics would still render in their original resolution and aspect ratio. We often see this type of functionality in the PC space. For example, many games weren't natively designed for or don't include support for ultra-wide aspect ratios, but you can sometimes still enable it at your own risk and deal with any issues. I also wish Nintendo had removed the black border around the GameCube games so that they fill the whole screen, or at least provided an option to scale them to fit or something. The black bars just look awkward. Overall though, I'm happy with the visual quality and the upscaling of the Switch Online experience, and it's been fun to revisit these titles on Nintendo hardware. I can't wait to see it applied to other beautiful GameCube games, such as the Metroid Prime titles. I'd be surprised if we didn't receive Prime 2 Echoes before the launch of Prime 4, or Kirby's Air Ride before the sequel in the fall, for example. But what do you think of the Switch 2 Online experience for GameCube games so far? Is it too early or too limited right now to even have an opinion? Which GameCube games do you think have held up exceptionally well, or would like to see added to the service? Please hit those subscribe and like buttons and leave a comment, and let's discuss.